Welcome to Classical Music Discoveries, the world's most listened to classical music podcast. Today, we continue our acclaimed CMD Music Education Series with an illuminating exploration into the life and legacy of one of America's most important composers. Your hosts for this episode are Dr. William Kenney of Kansas University, retired, and Maestra Kathryn Cavanaugh of the TMD Grand Opera Company of Venice. Together, Dr. Kenney and Maestro Cavanaugh guide us through this installment of our Music Education Series with their signature insight, scholarship, and artistry, brought to you, as always, by Classical Music Discovery. Settle in as we journey into the remarkable world of Florence Price, a pioneering voice whose music continues to inspire audiences around the globe.
In 2009, workers clearing out an abandoned house in St. Anne, Illinois, stumbled onto something in the attic. Boxes of sheet music, manuscripts, letters. They almost threw it all away. What they had found was a substantial collection of lost works by one of the most important composers in American history, a woman whose symphony had been performed by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at the World's Fair in 1933, and who had then been almost completely forgotten. Today, we're talking about Florence Price, who she was, what made her music so groundbreaking, and why her rediscovery is being compared to the Bach and Mahler revivals. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the forces that buried her legacy, the music that survived anyway, and what her story tells us about whose voices get preserved in the classical canon. I'm joined by someone who has spent serious time with this material, so let's get right into it. What do most people get wrong when they first hear Florence Price's name?
The biggest misconception is that she was a minor figure who got lucky with one big break. That is so far from the truth. Florence Price composed over 300 works, 4 symphonies, 4 concertos, choral works, art songs, chamber music, music for solo instruments. This was a prolific, serious, technically sophisticated composer working across 3 decades.
300 works. That's not a footnote, that's a career.
Exactly. And the career started early. According to Wikipedia, she was born Florence Beatrice Smith on April 9, 1887, in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her mother was a music teacher who guided her early training. She started piano lessons at age 3, gave her first public performance at 4, and had her first composition published at 11.
Published at 11. Okay, so this wasn't someone who discovered music late. She was immersed in it from basically the beginning.
Right. And she was academically exceptional too. She graduated as valedictorian of her class at 14. Then, in 1903, at 16, she enrolled at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston with a double major in piano pedagogy and organ performance.
But here's where it gets complicated, right? Because getting into the conservatory wasn't straightforward for her.
This is one of the most striking details in her biography. According to Wikipedia, when she enrolled, she listed her hometown as Pueblo, Mexico, and passed as Mexican to avoid racial discrimination against African Americans. She had to disguise her identity just to access the education she was fully qualified for.
That's a lot to sit with. She had to become someone else on paper to be allowed in the room.
And once she was in that room, she excelled. She studied composition and counterpoint with composers George Chadwick and Frederick Converse. She graduated in 1906 with honors, earning both an artist diploma in organ and a teaching certificate.
So she comes out of the conservatory with honors, and then what? Where does her career go from there?
She goes back south to teach. According to the University of Arkansas Digital Collections, she taught at Shorter College in Arkansas from 1906 to 1910, and then at Clark University in Georgia, which is now Clark Atlanta University, from 1910 to 1912, where she headed the music department. Then she married Thomas J. Price in 1912 and moved back to Little Rock.
And Little Rock at that time, that wasn't a safe or stable environment for a black family.
Not at all. According to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's reporting, she left Little Rock in the late 1920s fleeing rising racial violence in her native city, as well as domestic abuse at the hands of her first husband. She moved to Chicago, and that's where everything changed for her professionally.
Chicago in the late 1920s, that's a fascinating moment to arrive in that city.
It really was. The University of Arkansas Digital Collections notes that in Chicago, she enrolled at the Chicago Music College, studying orchestration and harmony. She met figures like Leo Sowerby, an influential composer of church music, and according to the documentary The Caged Bird, she also connected with important figures in what's described as the Black Renaissance, including Langston Hughes and Katherine Dunham.
So she's building this whole network, developing her craft further, and then the early 1930s arrive and things really accelerate.
Dramatically. In 1932, she won the Wanamaker Foundation Award for her Symphony No. 1 in E minor and her Piano Sonata in E minor, according to the St. Olaf analysis of her legacy. And then the following year, 1933, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra performed that symphony at the World's Fair. It was the first symphonic work by an African-American woman to be performed by a major American orchestra.
Wait, the World's Fair, so this wasn't some small venue. This was one of the most prominent cultural stages in the country at that moment.
Exactly. And the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's own reporting confirms this was a milestone premiere. The CSO has described it as the first work by a female black composer to be performed by a major orchestra. That's a historic marker that cannot be overstated.
And her music, let's talk about what it actually sounds like, what she was doing compositionally. Because it wasn't just European classical music with a different name on the cover.
Not at all. According to Britannica, Price's compositions integrated the rhythms and melodies of African-American spirituals, blues, and folk music with the European symphonic tradition. Her work was particularly influenced by the orchestral works of Antonin Dvořák. So she was doing something genuinely synthetic, bringing together two musical worlds in a way that was distinctly her own.
Dvořák is an interesting influence to name there because he was himself deeply interested in American folk music and what it could do for classical composition.
Right, and Price took that further. She wasn't just borrowing from folk traditions, she was someone who, as she herself wrote, understood that music from the inside. And that brings us to one of the most remarkable documents in her story.
The letter to Koussevitzky.
Yes. In 1941, Florence Price wrote to Serge Koussevitzky, who was the music director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. According to the St. Olaf analysis, she wrote, and I want to quote this directly because it's so powerful, "Having colored blood in my veins and having been born in the South, I believe I can say that I understand real Negro music as well, if not better than the kind I studied in the East. Having read that you are particularly interested in American music, I am hoping you will give something of mine a trial."
She's making a direct, reasoned case. She's not asking for charity, she's presenting credentials.
And he never responded, not once. According to that same analysis, this was the first of several correspondences to Koussevitzky, none of which received a reply. And here's the part that really stings. That same 1941 season, the Boston Symphony Orchestra programmed Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. A white male composer's jazz and blues-influenced classical work got the stage that Price was explicitly asking for.
That's not just a missed opportunity. That's a statement about whose version of American music was considered legitimate. Precisely. The St. Olaf analysis frames it exactly that way, as a deliberate sculpting of what American classical music was allowed to look like. Price was offering a fusion of antebellum music, ragtime, and jazz, colored by present cultural influences, in her own words, and that was passed over in favor of a white male composer doing something adjacent. And yet, she kept composing. She didn't stop.
She kept going. According to the University of Arkansas Digital Collections, in 1940 she became a member of the National Association for American Composers and Conductors, sponsored by prominent composer John Alden Carpenter, who was a great admirer of her work. And her Songs to the Dark Virgin was performed by Marian Anderson, one of the most celebrated singers of the era.
Marian Anderson performing her work, that's significant. Anderson herself was a figure who broke barriers in classical music.
And the connection goes further. According to the University of Arkansas Digital Collections, that concert attracted the attention of Eleanor Roosevelt, who attended a rehearsal while visiting the Federal Music Projects in Detroit. Price was subsequently invited to visit the First Lady at the White House.
So she had this incredible reach, the White House, the World's Fair, Marian Anderson, and still the full recognition she deserved was withheld.
That tension is at the heart of her story. And it's also why the 2009 discovery was so significant. According to Wikipedia, a substantial collection of her works and papers was found in her abandoned summer home. According to Britannica, this trove of lost sheet music and manuscripts led to renewed interest in her compositions.
And I want to make sure listeners really feel the weight of that. These weren't copies. These were originals sitting in an attic, in a house that was being cleared out. They almost didn't make it.
Almost. And what followed that discovery has been remarkable. According to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's reporting from January 2026, Price's works can now be heard on some 24 new recordings released in the last decade alone. G. Schirmer acquired the international publishing rights to her music in November 2018 and has published more than 100 of her compositions.
100 compositions published from a catalog that was nearly lost. That's extraordinary.
And in 2024, after her copyrighted works passed into the public domain, several other firms jumped into the mix as well, according to that same CSO reporting. The floodgates have opened.
Let's talk about the Grammy, because that feels like a real cultural moment.
In 2022, the Philadelphia Orchestra's recording of Price's Symphony No. 1 in E minor and Symphony No. 3 in C minor won a Grammy Award, according to Britannica. A composer who died in 1953, whose work was nearly discarded in an attic, winning a Grammy in 2022. That's a remarkable arc.
And there's a scholar who put this revival in really striking historical context, Michael Cooper at Southwestern University.
Yes. According to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's reporting, Cooper said, and this is a direct quote, "This is the most sustained revival of public and scholarly interest in a composer since the mid-20th century rediscovered Mahler. I think we're looking at something that is more than a moment here. I think it has the potential to be a movement in the sense that the Bach revival became a movement in the early 19th century, or the Mahler revival became a movement in the late 20th century.
Bach, Mahler, Florence Price. That's the company he's putting her in.
And Cooper has been working on this for a long time. According to the CSO, he heard the few works of Price that were known in the 1980s and was already convinced she was, in his words, clearly a serious composer to be reckoned with. In 2011, he began compiling a list of her works and tracking down the missing ones.
So the scholarly work was happening even before the broader public caught on.
Right. And the breadth of what's being uncovered is still expanding. According to Classical Voice North America, conductor John Jeter has recorded all of Price's symphonies for Naxos Records, and his most recent release focuses on her choral works, including 3 world premiere recordings.
World premieres of works she wrote over a century ago.
One of those is a multi-movement cantata called Abraham Lincoln Walks at Midnight, published in 1914 when Price was in her 20s. It sets a text by Illinois writer Vachel Lindsay about Lincoln returned to life, heartbroken by the state of modern America. The Classical Voice North America review describes it as surely destined to be a major work in the American choral repertoire.
A cantata about Lincoln grieving over America, written by a young black woman in 1914, the year before the release of Birth of a Nation, in the thick of Jim Crow. The layers there are just, yeah.
The Classical Voice North America review actually notes that the poem's imagery is more apt than ever now, well over a century later. Price had a way of choosing texts and subjects that carried weight far beyond their immediate moment.
And the BBC has been part of this revival too, right? BBC Radio 3 did a full Composer of the Week episode on her.
Yes, in May 2026, according to the Composer of the Week podcast listing. Kate Mollison explored Price's life and music alongside pianist and scholar Samantha E.J. The episode traced her story from childhood in Little Rock through her Chicago years and into the posthumous recognition. And the list of works featured is remarkable. Violin concertos, string quartets, fantasies, songs, symphonies. The range is stunning.
PBS also did a documentary episode on her, Florence Price and the American Migration, as part of the Great Performances series.
Right. According to PBS, host Scott Yu followed Price's trail from Little Rock to Chicago, exploring how West African music and European hymns inspired nearly all American popular music. The episode visited the Arkansas archives that house her work, the same archives that were originally found in the attic of that abandoned Chicago house.
Full circle. The attic to the archives to a PBS documentary.
And the University of Arkansas has digitized a significant portion of her papers, correspondence, photographs, concert programs, biographical documents to make them accessible to researchers worldwide according to their digital collections site. The scholarly infrastructure around her legacy is being built in real time.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, her father, because the JSTOR article by Barbara Garvey Jackson paints this picture of a family that was already navigating extraordinary circumstances.
Her father, James H. Smith, was the only African-American dentist in Little Rock, according to Wikipedia. The JSTOR article by Jackson goes deeper. He was active in Arkansas politics, served as one of the Arkansas electors in the Garfield election of 1880. He was a man of real standing in his community, despite the enormous pressures of the post-Reconstruction era. That context shaped Florence's sense of what was possible.
She grew up in a household where achievement was modeled, even when the system was working against you.
Exactly. And her mother was a music teacher, so music and ambition were both baked into her upbringing from the very beginning.
Let me push on something, though. There's a version of this story that frames Price purely as a victim of racism and sexism, and those forces were absolutely real and devastating. But is there a risk that framing overshadows the music itself?
That's a really important tension, and I think the answer is that the music has to be the center. Michael Cooper's comparison to Bach and Mahler isn't about their personal struggles, it's about the quality and depth of the work. Price's Symphony No. 1 won the Wanamaker Foundation Award on its own merits before the Chicago Symphony ever touched it. The music earned its place.
And the Grammy in 2022, that's not a sympathy award. That's a recording that competed and won.
Precisely. The Philadelphia Orchestra's recording of her Symphony No. 1 and Symphony No. 3 won on the strength of the music. That's the vindication, not just that she's being remembered, but that when people actually hear the work, it holds up completely.
And the Malmö Opera Orchestra recording those choral world premieres, that's a Swedish ensemble performing an American composer's work for the first time, a century after she wrote it. That's how far the reach has extended.
According to Classical Voice North America, the Malmö Opera Orchestra and Chorus, conducted by John Jeter, released that choral works album on Naxos. The reviewer noted the choir's English diction was always perfect and understandable, and described Price's handling of the Lincoln cantata text as precise and meaning-enhancing. This is serious musicianship meeting serious composition.
So when you step back from all of this, the early prodigy, the conservatory, the disguised identity, the Chicago breakthrough, the ignored letters, the Grammy, the attic manuscripts, what does Florence Price's story actually tell us about the classical music canon?
It tells us the canon was never neutral. It was constructed. The St. Olaf analysis makes this point directly. The decisions about whose music got performed, whose letters got answered, whose compositions got published, those were active choices that shaped what we think of as the American classical tradition. Price's exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was a pattern.
And the flip side of that is, if the canon was constructed, it can be reconstructed.
That's exactly what's happening right now. G. Schirmer publishing over 100 of her compositions, the Grammy, the BBC series, the PBS documentary, the Naxos recordings, the University of Arkansas Digital Archive. This is a collective act of reconstruction. And according to Michael Cooper, it may be just the beginning.
He called it potentially a movement, not just a moment.
Right, like the Bach revival in the early 19th century or the Mahler revival in the late 20s. Those weren't just rediscoveries, they fundamentally changed how we understand music history. If Price's revival reaches that scale, we're talking about a rewriting of the American musical story.
And here's what I keep coming back to. She composed over 300 works, 4 symphonies, 4 concertos, choral works, art songs, chamber music, and we're still finding world premieres. What else is out there that we haven't heard yet?
That's the open question. The 2009 discovery was enormous, but the work of cataloguing and recording is ongoing. Cooper started compiling his list in 2011, and the process is still unfolding. Every new recording, every new archive digitized, potentially surfaces something that hasn't been heard in decades, or ever.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. Florence Price did everything right. She was a prodigy. She got the elite education. She won the awards. She had her symphony performed at the World's Fair. She had Marian Anderson sing her songs. She wrote to the right conductors. And the system still found ways to minimize her. The manuscript still ended up in an attic.
And yet the music survived. That's the thing. Despite everything, the ignored letters, the domestic upheaval, the racial violence that drove her from her hometown, the gender bias that limited her access, she kept composing. Over 300 works. And now those works are winning Grammys and getting world premieres in Sweden.
There's something almost defiant about that. The music outlasted everything that tried to contain it.
The documentary about her life is literally called The Caged Bird, drawing on the Paul Laurence Dunbar metaphor for the oppression of Black Americans. But the point of that title, according to the IMDb description, is that Price refused to be a caged bird. She would not accept the limited aspirations that were expected of her race and gender.
And the music is the proof of that refusal.
Exactly. You can silence a person. You can ignore their letters, refuse to program their work, let their manuscripts gather dust in an attic. But if the music is good enough, and Price's is, it finds its way back.
So here's the provocation I want to leave listeners with. We found Florence Price's manuscripts in 2009 because someone happened to be clearing out an abandoned house. How many composers like her didn't get that lucky, whose music is still in an attic somewhere or already gone? The canon we inherited isn't complete. It's a starting point, and what we do with that knowledge is on us.
That's the real stakes of this conversation. Price's rediscovery is extraordinary, but it also raises the question of what we're still missing, and whether we're building the kind of institutions and practices that make sure the next Florence Price doesn't have to wait until 2009 to be found.
Well said. And on that note, remember, the next time you hear a symphony, ask yourself who else should be on that program. Florence Price's Symphony No. 1 in E minor is out there, it's recorded, it won a Grammy. Go listen to it. That's the most direct way to be part of this revival.
Thank you for joining us for this enlightening installment of the Classical Music Discoveries Music Education Series. Today, Dr. William Kenney and Maestra Kathryn Cavanaugh have guided us through the remarkable life and legacy of composer Florence Price, a trailblazing artist whose voice continues to shape the landscape of American classical music. We hope this episode has deepened your appreciation for her extraordinary contributions and inspired you to explore more of her unforgettable works. As always, Classical Music Discoveries is made possible through the generosity of our listeners. If you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to support our mission by making a donation using the safe and secure PayPal QR code displayed on your screen. Your contributions help us continue bringing exceptional music and educational content to audiences around the world. For Classical Music Discoveries, this has been the CMD Music Education Series. Until next time, thank you for listening.